Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I'm here today to start another read aloud. We're going to be reading from the Protector of the Small series. The first book is called First Test, and this is written by Tamora Pierce. This book is published by, let me see, RandomHouse, New York. So let's go ahead and dive right in. The first thing that we actually see is a map, and here is Tortle, which is where most of our story will take place. This is the whole kingdom of Tortle here, but we're going to be talking about this town, this one. You'll see. Chapter 1, Decisions. Alana, the lioness, the king's champion, could hardly contain her glee. Baron Pierce of Mindolin had written to King Jonathan to say that his daughter wished to be a page. Alana fought to sit still as she watched Wilden of Cavell, the royal training master, read the baron's letter. Seated across his desk from them, the king watched the training master as sharply as his champion did. Lord Wilden was known for his dislike of female warriors. It had been 10 long years since the proclamation that girls might attempt a page's training. Alana had nearly given up hope that such a girl, or the kind of family that would allow her to do so, existed in Tortle, but at last she had come forward. Keldry of Mindolin would not have to hide her sex for 8 years, as Alana had done. Keldry would be able to prove to the world that girls could be knights, and she would not be friendless. Alana had plans to help Keldry through the first few years. It never occurred to her, the champion, that anyone might object. Alana half turned to see Wilden better. Surely he'd read the letter at least twice. From this side, the puffy scars from his battle to save the younger princes and princess were starkly visible. Wilden's right arm was in a sling yet from that fight. Alana rubbed fingers that itched with the urge to apply healing magic. Wilden had the idea that suffering pain made a warrior stronger. He would not thank her if she tried to heal him now. Goddess bless, she thought tiredly. How will I ever get on with him if I'm to help this girl Keldry? Wilden was not flexible. He'd proven that to the entire court over and over. If he were any stiffer, Alana thought wryly, I'd paint a design on him and use him for a shield. He's got no sense of humor, and he rejects change just because it's change. Still, she had to admit that his teaching worked. During the Immortals' War of the spring and early summer, when legendary creatures had joined with the realm's human enemies to take the kingdom, the squires and pages had been forced into battle. They had done well, thanks to their training by Wilden and the teachers he had picked. At last, Lord Wilden returned the letter to King Jonathan, who placed it on his desk. The Baron and the Baroness of Mindolin are faithful servants of the crown, the king remarked. We would not have this treaty with the Yamani Islands if it were not for them. You will have read that their daughter received some warrior training at the Yamani court, so it would appear that Keldry has an aptitude. Lord Wilden resettled his arm in its sling. I did not agree to this, Your Majesty. Alana was about to say that he didn't have to agree when she saw the king give the tiny shake of his head. Clenching her jaws, she kept her remark to herself. As King Jonathan raised his eyebrows. Your predecessor agreed, he reminded Wilden, and you, my lord, implied agreement when you accepted the post of training master. That's a lawyer's reply, sire, Wilden replied stiffly, a slight flush rising in his clean-shaven cheeks. Then here is a king's. We desire this girl to train as a page. And that is that, Alana thought, satisfied. She might be the kind of knight who would argue with her king, at least in private, but Wilden would never let himself do so. The training master absently rubbed the arm in its linen sling. At last he bowed in his chair. May we compromise, sire? Alana stiffened. She hated that word. She began to say. The king silenced her with a look. What do you want, my lord? In all honesty, the training master said, thinking out loud, I had thought that our noble parents loved their daughters too much to place them in so hard a life. Not everyone is afraid to do anything new, Alana replied sharply. Lioness, said the king, his voice dangerously quiet. Alana clenched her fist. What was going on? Was Jonathan inclined to give way to the man who'd saved his children? Wilden's eyes met her squarely. Your bias is known, Lady Alana. To the king he said, surely the girl's parents cannot be aware of the difficulties she will encounter. Baron Pierce and Lady Elaine are not fools, replied King Jonathan. They have given us 3 good worthy knights already. Lord Wilton gave a reluctant nod. Anders, Ines, and Conall of Mindolin were credits to their training. The realm would feel the loss of Anders, whose war wounds could never heal entirely from the active duty roles. It would take years to replace those who were killed or maimed in the Immortal War. Sire, please think this through, Wilden said. We need the realm's sons. Girls are fragile, more emotional, easier to frighten. They are not as strong in their arms and shoulders as men. They tire easily. This girl would get any warriors who served with her killed on some dark night. Alana started to get up. This time King Jonathan walked out from behind his desk. Standing beside his champion, he gripped one of her shoulders, keeping her in her chair. But I will be fair, Wilden continued. His brown eyes were hard. Let her be on probation for a year. By the end of the summer field camp, if she has not convinced me of her ability to keep up, she must go home. Who judges her fitness? Inquired the king. Wilden's lips tightened. Who but the training master, sire? I have the most experience in evaluating the young for their roles as future knights. Alana turned to stare at the king. No boy has ever undergone a probationary period, she cried. Wilden raised his good shoulder in a shrug. Perhaps they should. For now I will not tender my resignation over this, provided I judge whether the girl stays or goes in 1 year's time. The king weighed the request. Alana fidgeted. She knew Lord Wilden meant his threat, and the crown needed him. Too many great nobles, dismayed by the changes in Tortal since Jonathan's coronation, felt that Wilden was their voice at court. If he resigned, the king and queen would find it hard to get support for their future changes. At last King Jonathan said, Though we do not always agree, my lord, you know that I respect you, because you are fair and honorable. I would hate to see that fairness, that honor, tainted in any way. Geladri of Mindolin will have a year's probation. Lord Wilden nodded and then inspected the nails on his good hand. There is one other matter, he remarked slowly. He looked at Alana. Do you plan to involve yourself in the girl's training? It will not do. Alana bristled. What is that supposed to mean? You wish to help the girl, understandably. Wilden spoke as though the mild words made his teeth hurt. But you rarely deal with the lads, my lady. If you help the girl, it will be said that you eased her path in some special way. There are rumors that your successes are due to your magical gift. By the goddess, snapped Alana, crimson with fury. If the king had not forbidden her to challenge men on personal grounds years before, she would have taken Wilden out to the dueling courts and made him regret his words. Alana, for heaven's sake, you know the gossip, King Jonathan said. Stop acting as if you've never heard it before. He looked at Wilden. And you suggest? Lady Alana must be kept from contact with the girl, Wilden replied firmly. Even a moment's conversation will give rise to suspicion. All contact, cried Alana, but she'll be the only girl among over 20 boys. She'll have questions. She realized what she had said and fell silent. King Jonathan gently patted her shoulder. Is there no other way? He asked. Wilden shook his head. I fear not, sire. The Mindolin girl will be the cause of trouble as it is, without the lioness hovering over her. The king thought it over. At last, he sighed. Lord Wilden has the right of it. You must stay away from Geladri of Mindolin, Alana. But Jonathan, sire, she pleaded, not believing he would do this. That is an order, Lady Knight. If you cannot accept that, say as much now, and I will find you work elsewhere. She stared at him for a long moment, lips tight. At last she got to her feet. Don't tax yourself. I'll find night's work for myself, she told him, as far from course as possible. She stalked out of the room, slamming the door in her wake. The men stared at the door. Each was trying to remember if Alana the Lioness had ever spoken to Jonathan in that tone before. Baron Pierce and Lady Elaine of Mindolin watched Geladri read the reply from the training master. A Tortalian who did not know them well might have thought the man and woman felt nothing and that their 10-year-old daughter was only concerned, not upset. It was far from true. The family had spent the last 6 years living in the Yamani Islands, where displays of deep emotion were regarded shameful. To get the Yamani's respect, they had all learned to hide their feelings. Home in Midland again, they still acted as Yamanis, hiding uneasiness and even distress behind still faces. Kel struggled to reread the letter, afraid to say a word. If she did, her shaking voice would give her away. Instead, she waited as she tried to control the anger and sense of betrayal that filled her. "It's not the reply we expected," Baron Pierce said at last. He was a short, stocky man. Keldry had his build, delicate nose, and dreamy, long-lashed hazel eyes. Her brown hair was several shades lighter than him. When Kel did not reply, he continued, His declaration of 10 years ago was that girls could become pages. Nothing was said of probation then." "Keldry," asked her mother, "you can say what you feel. We're no longer among the Yamanis." She was a thin, elegant woman, taller than her husband by nearly a head, with hair that had gone white very early in life, and a deep musical voice. All Keldry had from her was her height. At the age of 10, the girl was already 5 feet tall and still growing. It took Kel a moment to register what her mother had said. She tried to smile. "But, Mama, I don't want to get into bad habits in case I go back with you." She looked at Lord Wilden's letter again. She expected to be a page when her parents returned to the Yamani Islands in 18 months. From the tone of this letter, perhaps she ought not to count on that. "It isn't right," she said quietly, even fiercely. "No boys have probation. I'm supposed to be treated the same." "Don't give your answer yet," Baron Pierce said quickly. "Take the letter with you. Think about what it says. You're not hasty, Kel. This is a bad time to start." "Reflect as if you have all the time, even when time is short," added her mother in Yamani. "Be as stone." Kel bowed Yamani style, palms flat on her thighs. Then she went to find some place quiet to think. First she went to her room beside the nursery. That wasn't a good choice. 2 of her brother's young families lived at Mindlin. With the children and their nursemaids next door, there was enough noise to drown out trumpets. No one had seen her creep into the room, but her oldest nephew saw her leaving. Nothing would do for him but that she'd give him a piggyback ride around the large room. After that, all of the other older children wanted rides of their own. Once that was done, the nursemaids helped Kel to escape. She tried to hole up by the fountain in the castle garden, but her sisters-in-law were there, sewing and gossiping with their maids. The kitchen garden was her next choice, but 2 servants were there, gathering vegetables. She stared longingly at her favorite childhood spot, the highest tower in the castle, and felt a surge of anger. Before they had gone to the islands, her brother, Connell, had teasingly held her over the edge of the tower balcony. Until that time, she had visited the top of that tower at least once a day. Now the thought of it made her shudder. There were hundreds of places that she might use around the castle, but they were all indoors. She needed to be outside. She was trying to think of a place when she remembered the broad, shallow Daman River, which ran through the woods. No one would be there. She could sit by the water and think in peace. "Miss," called a voice as she strode through the inner gate in the castle wall. "Where might you be going?" Kel turned to face the man-at-arms who had called to her. "I don't know." The man held out a small horn. "If you're not going to the village, you need one of these." He spoke carefully. The Baron and his family had been home for only 3 months, and the people were still not quite sure what to make of these strange Yamani-like nobles. "They told you the rule, surely. Anytime you go outside the castle or village, you take a horn. You never know when one of them monsters, or centaurs, or giants, or whatever, will show its face." Kel frowned. The legendary creatures had returned to their world 5 years before, but they had an unnerving way of showing up when they were least expected. For everyone that was harmless or willing to get on with humans, there were fistfuls that weren't. Bands of men-at-arms now roamed through the fiefdom, searching for hostile visitors and listening for the horn call that meant someone was in trouble. "I'm not going very far," she wanted to argue, but the Yamanis had taught her to obey a soldier's commands. She accepted the horn with a quick and quiet thank you, and slung it over one shoulder. Checking that Lord Wilden's letter was still tucked securely in the front of her shirt, she left the road that led from the castle gate and headed through their orchards. Once she was past the cultivated trees, she entered the woods, following a trail down to the water. By the time that she could see a glint of silver through the trees, she had worked up a mild sweat. The day was warm, and the walk was longer than she had thought it would be. When a rock worked its way into her shoe, she sat on a log to get it out. "It's not right," she muttered to herself, undoing the laces that held the leather around her ankle. You're a page for 4 years. That's how it's been done for centuries. Now they're gonna change it? When she upended the shoe and shook it, nothing fell out. She stuffed a hand inside, feeling around for the stone. And just 'cause I'm a girl, they ought to treat me the same. All I want is the same chance as the boys. No more, no less. She winced as a sharp edge nipped at one of her fingers. Working more carefully, she wiggled a bit of rock out of a fold in the leather. Probation is not fair, and knighthood training has to be fair. The stone was out. Her mind was made up. If they couldn't treat her the same as they would the boys, then she wouldn't settle for a half portion. She would have to become a warrior some other way. Kel sighed and put her shoe back on. The problem was that she would now have to wait. The Queen's riders took volunteers when they were 15 or older. The Queen's ladies, those who were expected to ride, handle a bow, and deal with trouble at Queen Fayette's side, went to her in their 15th year as well. And who was to say Kel wouldn't be living in the Yamani Islands by then? One thing she knew. Convent school, the normal destination for noble girls her age, was not a choice. Kel had no interest whatsoever in ladylike arts, and even less interest in the skills needed to attract a husband or manage a castle. Even if she did, who would have her? Once she overheard her sisters-in-law comment that no man would be interested in a girl who was built along the lines of a cow. She had made the mistake of repeating that comment to her mother when Kel's plan to be a page had first come up. Her mother had gone white with fury and had put her daughters-in-law to mending several years' worth of old linens. It had taken a great deal of persuasion for Kel to convince her mother that her quest for knighthood did not mean she wanted to settle for second best, knowing she would never marry. Getting Elaine of Mindolin to agree to her being a page had been a negotiation every bit as complicated as what her father had done to get the Yamanis to sign the treaty. And see what good that did me, Kel thought with disgust. Lord Wilden offers me second best anyway, and I won't take it. I could have saved my breath talking Mama around. She was ready to get to her feet when the sound of bodies crashing through the brush made her look up. Gruff voices reached her ear. "Hurry up," a boy growled from near the river. "Do you want us to get caught?" "The cow's at home," replied a second boy's voice. "She stays there all morning." Kel stood listening. If they were on the lookout for her, then they were up to something bad. In just 3 months, she had taught the local boys that she was someone to respect. Kel grabbed a sturdy fallen branch and ran towards their voices. Racing into the open ground between the trees and river, she saw 3 village boys. They were about to throw a wriggling cloth sack into the Daman. Her mouth set into a tight, angry line. Her hazel eyes glittered. "Put that down!" she cried. The boys whirled, startled, dropping their burden on a half-submerged tree limb. One of them punched the smallest in the shoulder. "Home all morning, eh?" Kel shouted, "I know all of you, and you all know the law in Midland. No killing of animals without the Baron's leave." The biggest, taller than she by half a head, advanced. The other 2 were right behind him. "And who's to make us stop, cow?" The Yamanis had taught her well. She had waded into the boys, using her club as an equalizer. She whacked them in the belly so they couldn't breathe, and on the collarbones and biceps so they couldn't raise their arms. One youth punched her face. He caught her on the outside of one eye. She changed her grip on the branch and swept his feet from under him, and then stood on one of his arms. Another lad grabbed a branch and swung at her. She blocked with hers and then rammed the length of wood into his stomach. He doubled over, gasping. Kel shoved him into the 3rd boy. Down they went in a tumble. When they untangled themselves, they ran. Their comrade also chose to make his escape. Kel looked around for the sack. The current had tugged the tree limb on which it rested out into the deeper, faster water at the center of the river. She didn't hesitate, but waded into the water. Kel was a good swimmer, and the river was fairly shallow. She doubted whatever small creatures were struggling in the sack could swim. Movement on the far bank made her look up. What she saw made her halt, cold water rushing around her thighs. Something black and strange-looking had walked out from under the shelter of the trees. It looked like a giant furred spider, nearly 5 feet tall, with one difference. The thing had human teeth. It stared at Kel and then grinned broadly to reveal a human head. It grinned to reveal its sharp teeth. Her flesh crawled. The hairs stood up on her arms and the back of her neck. Spydren, she thought, recognizing it from its description. Spydrens in our wood. Like most of the legendary creatures that now prowled the human realms, they were virtually immortal, immune to disease and old age. They died only when something or someone took the pains to kill them. They fed on animals and human blood. No one could get Spydrens to make peace with human beings. The thing reared on its back legs, revealing a light-colored shaft at the base of its belly. From it, the Spydren squirted a high-flying gray stream that soared into the air over the river. Kel threw herself to one side, away from the gray stream, and the sack that she was trying to catch. The stuff was like rope. She realized it was a web when it fell in a long line across the surface of the water. It had missed her, but only by a foot. The Spydren bent and snipped the rope off from its belly spinneret with a claw. Swiftly, it began to wind the length of the web around another clawed foot. As it dragged through the water, the sticky thing caught on the cloth sack. The Spydren reeled in its catch like a fisherman might pull in its line. Kel brought the horn up to her mouth. She blew 5 hard blasts and might have continued to blow until help had come as the Spydren gathered up the sack. It discarded its web with one clawed foot and then held the sack with a second and reached in with a third. The beast grinned, its eyes never leaving Kel as it pulled out a wet and squirming kitten. The horn fell from the girl's lips as the Spydren looked the kitten over. It smacked its lips and then bit the small creature in half and began to chew. Kel screamed and groped on the river bottom with both hands for ammunition. Coming up with a stone in each fist, she hurled the first. It soared past the Spydren, missing by inches. Her next stone caught it square in the head. It shrieked and then began climbing the bluff that overlooked the river to its left, still holding the sack. In the distance, Kel heard the sound of horns. Help was on its way, for her, but not for those kittens. She scrabbled for more stones and plunged across the river, battling the water to get to the same shore as the monster. It continued to climb the rocky face of the bluff until it reached the summit just as Kel scrambled onto land. Once she was on solid ground, she began to climb the bluff, her soaked feet digging for purchase in soft dirt and rock. Above her, the Spydren leaned over the edge of the bluff to leer at her. It reached into the sack, dragged out a second kitten, and began to eat it. Kel still had the rock in her right hand. She hurled it as hard as she'd ever thrown a ball to knock down a target. It smashed the Spydren's nose. The thing shrieked and hissed, dropping the rest of its meal. Kel's foot slipped. She looked down to find a better place to set it and froze. She was only 7 feet above the water, but the distance seemed more like 70 to her. A roar filled her ears and her head spun. Cold sweat trickled through her clothes. She clung to the face of the bluff with both arms and legs, sick with fear. Leaving the sack on the ground, the Spydren threw a loop of web around a nearby tree stump. When it was set, the creature began to lower itself over the side of the bluff. Its hate-filled eyes were locked on the girl, whose terror had frozen her in place. Kel was deaf and blind to the Spydren's approach. Later, she could not recall hearing the monster scream as arrows thudded into its flesh, just as she could not remember the arrival of her brothers Anders and his men-at-arms. With the Spydren's death, its web rope snapped. The thing hurled past Kel to splash into the river. A man-at-arms climbed up to get her, gently prying her clutching fingers from their holds. Only when Kel was safely on the shore, seated on a flat rock, was she able to tell them why she had tried to kill a Spydren with only stones for weapon. Someone climbed the bluff to retrieve the sack of kittens, while Kel stared, shivering, at the Spydren's body. Her brother Anders dismounted stiffly and limped over to her. Reaching into his belt pouch, he pulled out a handful of fresh mint leaves, crushed them on one gloved hand, and held them under Kel's nose. She breathed in their fresh scent gratefully. "You're supposed to have real weapons when you go after something that's twice as big as you are," he told her mildly. "Didn't the Yamanis teach you that?" During the years most of their family had been in the islands, Anders, Inez, and Connell, the 3 oldest sons of the manor, had served the crown as pages, squires, and then knights. All they knew of Kel's experiences there came in their family's letters. "I had to do something," Kel explained. "Calling for help and staying put would have been wiser," he pointed out. "Leave the fighting to real warriors. Here we are." A man-at-arms put the recovered sack into his hands. Anders, in turn, put the bag in Kel's lap. Nervously, she opened the bag. 5 wet kittens, their eyes barely opened. turned their faces up to her, protesting their morning's adventure. "I'll take you to our housekeeper," Cal promised them. "She'll know what to do with kittens." Once the animals were seen to, and she had changed into clean gown and slippers, Cal went to her father's study. With her came a small group of animals: 2 elderly dogs, 3 cats, 2 puppies, a kitten, and a 3-legged pine marten. Cal gently moved them out of the way and closed the doors before they could sneak in. Anders was there, leaning on a walking stick as he talked to their parents. All 3 adults fell silent and looked at Cal. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "I want the training and the right weapons. Anders was right. It was stupid to go after a spider with stones." "And if they send you home at the end of a year?" asked Elaine of Middelin. Cal took a deep breath. "Then I'll still know more than I do now," she said firmly. Pierce looked at his wife, who nodded. "Then we'd best pack," said Elaine, getting to her feet. "You'll leave the day after tomorrow." Passing Cal on her way to the door, her mother touched the eye that the village boy had hit. It was red and blue and puffy. Not the worst black eye Cal had ever gotten. "Let's also get a piece of raw meat to put on this," suggested the woman. The next evening, Cal made her way to the stables to visit her pony, Chipper, to explain to him that the palace would supply her with a knight's mount. The pony lifted her shirt in an understanding way. He, at least, would be in good hands. Anders' oldest son was ready to start riding, and he loved the pony. "Thought I might find you here," a voice said as Cal fed Chip an apple. She squeaked in surprise. For a man with a limp and a cane, Anders moved very quietly. "You know we'll take care of him." Cal nodded and picked up a brush to groom the pony's round sides. "I know. I'll miss him all the same." Anders leaned against a post. "Cal..." She looked at him. Since the incident on the river the day before, she'd caught Anders watching her. She barely remembered him before their departure to the islands 6 years ago. He had already been a knight, handsome and distant in his armor, always riding somewhere. In the months since their return to Middelin, she had come to like him. "Something the matter?" she asked. Anders sighed. "Do you realize it's going to be hard? Maybe impossible. They'll make it tough. There's hazing, for one thing. I don't know when the custom started, but it's called earning your way. It's just for first-year pages. The senior ones make you run stupid little errands, like fetching gloves and picking up things that get knocked over. You have to do it. Otherwise, it's the same as saying you don't have to do what the older pages did, as if you think you're better than they are. And older pages play tricks on the younger one, and some of them will pick fights. Stand up for yourself, or they will make your life a misery. And the rules they sent, fighting isn't allowed. Of course it's forbidden. Of course, it's forbidden. If you're caught, they punish you. That's expected. What you must never do is tattle on another page or say who you fought with. That's expected too. Tell them you fell down. That's what I always say. Otherwise, no one will trust you. A boy told when I was a page, and he finally left because no one would speak to him. But they'll punish me for fighting? With chores, extra lessons, things like that. You take every punishment, whatever it's for, and keep quiet. Like the Yamani, she said, brushing loose hairs from Chipper's coat. You don't talk, you obey. Anders nodded. Just do what you're told. Don't complain. If you can't do it, say that you failed, not that you can't. No one can finish every task that's given. What your teachers don't want is excuses or blaming someone else or saying it's unfair. They know it's unfair. Do what you can and take your punishment in silence. Cal nodded. I can do that, I think. Anders chuckled. That's the strange thing. I believe you can, but Cal went to Chip's far side, looking at Anders over the pony's back. What? The young man absently rubbed his stiff leg. Cal, all those things that you learned in the islands. Yes, she prodded when he fell silent again. You might want to keep them to yourself. Otherwise, the pages might think you believe you're better than they are. You don't want to be different, all right? At least not any more different than you already are. Won't they want to learn new things? She wanted to know. I would. Not everyone's like you, Cal. Do what they teach you, no more. You'll save yourself a lot of heartache that way. Cal smiled. I'll try, she told him. Anders straightened with a wince. Don't be out here too long, he reminded her. You're up before dawn. Unlike normal dreams, in which time and places and people did strange things, this dream was completely true to Cal's memory. It began as she knelt before an altar and stared at the swords placed upon it. The weapons were sheathed in pure gold, rubbed as smooth and bright as glass. She was 5 years old again. These are the swords given to the children of the fire goddess Yama, the lady-in-waiting beside Kel said, in awe in her soft voice. The short sword is the sword of law. Without it we are only animals. The long sword is the sword of duty. It is the terrible sword, the killing sword. Her words struck a chord in Kel that left the little girl breathless. She liked the idea that duty was a killing sword. Without duty, the lady continued, duty to our lords, to our family, and to the laws, we are less than animals. Kel smelled burning wood. She looked around curious. The large oil lamps that hung from the temple ceiling by thick cords smelled of perfume, not wood. Kel sniffed the air. She knew that fires were terrible on the Yamani Islands. Our indoor walls were often paper screens, and straw mats covered floors of polished wood. The lady-in-waiting got to her feet. The temple doors crashed open. There was Kel's mother, Elaine, her outer kimono flapping open, her thick, pale hair falling out of its pins. In her hands, she carried a staff capped with a broad, curved blade. Her blue-green eyes were huge in her bone-white face. Please excuse me, she told the lady-in-waiting, as calm and polite as any Yamani in danger, but we must get out of here and find help. Pirates have attacked the cove and are within the palace. There was a thunder of shod feet on polished wood floors. Swords and axes crashed through the paper screens that formed the wall behind the altar. Scarans, men already covered in blood and grime, Scanrans, men already covered in blood and grime, burst into the room, fighting their way clear of the screens and their wooden frames. An arm wrapped tightly around Kel's ribs, yanking her from her feet. The lady-in-waiting had scooped her up in one arm and the swords in the other. Faster than the raiders, she ran to Elaine of Middelin. The lady tumbled to the ground. Kel slid out the door on her belly. Turning, too startled to cry, she saw the lady at her mother's feet. There was an arrow in the Yamani woman's back. Elaine bent over the dead woman and took the swords. Hoisting them in one hand, she swung her weapon to her left and right. It sheared through the heavy cords that suspended 5 large oil lamps. They fell and shattered, spilling a flood of burning oil. It raced across the temple and the path of the raiders who were running towards them. When their feet began to burn, they halted, trying to put the fire out. Come on, Kel's mother urged. Hike up those skirts and run. Kel yanked her kimono up and fled with Elaine. They skidded and slipped over polished floors in their Yamani sock shoes, and then turned down one corridor and another. Far down one passage, they saw a new group of Scanrans. Kel and her mother ran around a corner. They tried another turning. It led to a dead end. They were trapped. The walls that now blocked them on 3 sides were sturdy wood, too. They could have cut their way through the paper ones. Elaine turned. Scanrans armed with swords or axes were blocking their way out. Elaine thrust the gold swords into Kel's arm and pushed her into a corner, and then stood before her. Get down and be quiet, she said, gripping her weapon in both hands. I think I can hold them off with this. Kel put the swords behind her and huddled. The men came at her mother, laughing and joking, in Scanran. She peeked around the edges of her mother's kimono. At that moment, Elaine swung the bladed staff. Glaive, Kel remembered, as it swung. They called it a glaive. In a wide side cut, slicing one pirate across the chest. Whipping it back to her left, she caught another of them in the throat. Blood struck Kel's face. Even dreaming, she could smell it. Breathless, the sheathed swords poking her in the back, she watched her mother lunge and retreat, using her skill and her longer weapon to hold the enemy off. Elaine killed a 3rd and 4th attacker before a squad of guardsmen raced around the corner to finish the rest. When the pirates were dead, Kel's mother turned and reached a hand out to her. Let's go find your father, she said quietly. Kel grasped the hand and let her mother pull her to her feet. Then Kel gathered up the golden swords that had been trusted to them. When they faced their rescuers, the guards knelt as one. They bowed low to the woman and the girl, touching their heads to the bloody floor. Kel woke, breathing fast, eyes shining. Her heart raced and she trembled all over. The dream was not scary, it was exciting. She loved that it had all been real. I want to be like that, she told herself. As she always said, I want to protect people. And I will be a hero one day, just like Mama, just like the lioness. No one will kill 2 kittens in front of me then. That's where we're going to stop today. We'll pick up tomorrow with chapter 2, Not So Welcome. We've been reading the first book of the Protector of the Small series, The First Test. It's by Tamora Pierce, and by Tamora Pierce, excuse me, and published by RandomHouse. My name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.